Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, yesterday when I posted that question on Quora, I know that we had some comments under the guy's response regarding race and intelligence, and he brought up the fact that basically the immigration policies and rules are skewed more towards educated African immigrants to come over into this country compared to the general population. And he did bring up I don't know, I guess he was basing it off of the bell curve study that was
Yes.
did, I know, a long time ago, and where it said, I guess, the average African as a whole, has an IQ of basically 70, which I've read into the study of the bell curve,
Yeah.
and I have read into race and intelligence. And me personally, I've always felt that those types of studies are pretty biased because, generally speaking, like, and even if you go back and do research on the bell curve,
Mhm.
there was a scientist who debunked it. I forgot his name. I'll send you the link into your Facebook so you can read the study. But he said the problem with the bell curve is when he was comparing like Africans to Europeans and Asians, he was comparing poor Africans to really educated Asians and Europeans. And if you look at, IQ tests across the board, you will see
Mhm.
that it varies, greatly by, class, poverty, and those types of
Yeah.
things. For
Yeah.
example, like they found out like down south, white men had much lower IQ rates compared to white men in the Northeast. And the
Mhm.
same thing over in the UK when they compared Welsh to actual London. So I wanted to get your point of view on it because I saw your comment and you said that a new study came out, which I haven't read into, which
Mhm.
stated that the IQ of Africans is actually, I think you said from 80 to 110, somewhere around there.
Yeah, it's in the 80 range, and it actually isn't a new study. I think it was done in 2011, but it's a very important study in this topic because it examines studies done by Richard Lynn, which is the origin of the 70 and 60 estimation. And it basically what it does is it analyzes and deconstructs the methods that he used. And the methods he used were very dishonest.
Mhm.
He estimated the national IQs of countries based on proximity to other countries, and he used samples from populations that were not representative of the general population.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and
so,
I'm sorry.
what Richards did, the scientist I'm referring to, what he did was he made his own calculations and estimations, and he reasoned that at this point in time, or at that point in time, the average intelligence of Africans was in the range of the 80s.
Hmm.
And that's also very relevant to the scores cited for African Americans because the score cited for African Americans is 85. And because African Americans are intermixed with Europeans, you would expect there to be a much wider difference.
Yeah,
If,
and I
yes.
remember, I'm sorry. I remember I know he was I know I remember there was someone who was basically using the argument. I don't know if it was Richard Lynn or Charles Martin, but he was basically saying that I guess he's one of those believers that race is a biological reality. But if you look at DNA and if you look at the fact that as humans we have A negative, B positive, O blood, I think there's one more across the board, you'll see that our DNA is 99.9% similar. And
Yes.
the reason why we look different is really because of geographics.
Yeah, environmental pressure.
Yeah, and genetic mutations like why people have blue eyes, why people have brown eyes, and those types of things. But I guess
Mhm.
he was basically using the argument that since there, I guess, are basically since race is a biological that showing that IQ there's differences in IQ between races, which basically proves, I guess, a biological reality of race. But this the question I asked: if Europeans, hypothetically speaking, have the I don't know, the highest IQs, like I said, which is pretty biased. And African Americans have a lot of European blood in them. I mean, wouldn't their IQs be just as high then if it was really based off of genetics?
If it
You
was
know,
based off of genetics, you would expect the difference between Native Africans and African Americans to be much wider than it is. But the fact is that it isn't. And
mhm.
I will mention that the 85 number is no longer correct for African Americans. It has raised since then to 89 and 90 average. But still, you would expect the difference between intermixed African Americans and Caribbeans to be far, far wider. You would expect the difference between intermixed Africans and pureblood Africans to be wider
Yeah.
based on what we know about what intermixing does for other traits.
Yeah, and you know that's it's interesting that you bring that up because I've always been one of those individuals where I've always said that if you're going to do a study, you know, based off race and ethnicity, you have to look at you have to look at the complexities because
Yeah,
it's
you have
like
the subgroups, the
yeah,
subpopulations. And,
because I was trying to explain to this guy, I was talking to yesterday. He was a fellow from Nigeria, I believe, and he was bringing up the fact that I'm gonna go a little bit off topic. This doesn't really have anything to do with IQ. I guess you could say it has more to do
yeah,
with educational attainment because you have some
yeah,
stupid people with college degrees.
yeah.
But I was telling him, you know, Nigerian Americans in the United States are the most educated group based off statistics, and one of the top three earners, and they fare much better in college, high school, et cetera, compared to African Americans. But
Mm-hmm.
he didn't take in consideration that, to get from Nigeria all the way to America, a plane ticket is like $2,000. He didn't take in consideration that when you look at the most educated countries in the world, Nigeria is not even in the top 25. And if you look at the actual illiteracy rates and look at how many people have college degrees in Nigeria, I think it's only like 6%, like 7% of the general population of Nigeria has a bachelor's degree, whereas over here in America, around 68 to 75% have a bachelor's degree. So I told him if it really came down to being intellectually superior or having how can I say, a culture of education, you would expect those numbers to be a lot higher in places like Nigeria. And same thing goes with Chinese Americans. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
70% have bachelor's degrees, whereas based off 2012, only 9% of their population in China has bachelor's degrees. And even a much lower have PhDs. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I don't know. Like I said, a lot of people, and I mean, we can always, when it comes to the situation in Africa, we can blame corrupt governments, we could blame lack of resources or lack of funding for schools, but that just proves the point that it has nothing whatsoever to do with like a certain race of people or a certain subgroup of people being genetically superior or having a superior culture.
Yeah, and what makes this topic such a minefield, I think, is that there's so many factors that influence and are subject to affect IQ levels and what the test reflects. And it's important to remember that an IQ test is phenotypical. It's a phenotype. It's what we can observe on the outside. But if there are external interferences, then its ability to accurately estimate a person's actual genetic intelligence is impaired.
Yeah, I tell everybody that too. It's like, I mean, when you look at like in the United States, when you look at the majority of these poor neighborhoods in the inner city, which is a predominantly, African American, I mean, when you've been pretty much so marginalized, basically locked out of college due to high prices and not actually having those resources to get scholarships and everything because of lack of public schools and in broken homes, I mean, it's going to be hard for a child or a teenager growing up into that environment to be able to learn well. It's just because he's
Mm-hmm.
dealing with so many outside forces outside of school. And
Yeah.
yeah, and that's something I try to explain to people every single day. I mean, if a kid can barely get sleep at night because his house is in so much discord, he's not going to be able to sit down and focus in a classroom setting. He's just not going to be. And
And
yeah.
one thing I've done a lot of research on is the development of the brain over the course of a person's lifespan, from infancy all the way to late adolescence and adulthood. And what you will find is that during a process known as synaptic pruning, a lot of psychological and mental resources can be lost if they aren't used regularly, like it's use it or lose it, so to speak. So, what happens a lot of the time, I see it reflected in these IQ studies, is that the gains made by the children in the studies don't last. And what a racialist will tell you is that, oh, that's because they're returning to their genetic potential. But there is evidence that the gains that they have made are real and on the G factor. And what the G factor is it's a figure that represents general intelligence. Like basically what the G factor is it predicts that if you do well on one test, you'll do well on all the others. So the G factor is very important. But the reason why they're wrong when they say that it's the process of returning to genetic intelligence is because the G factor actually represents the same concept across all ages. So if you have IQs raised on the G factor as children, the only other reason why the effects of the study could be fading out is synaptic pruning, which means these children are returning to their original environments and they are, for some reason, they're not getting the chance to use the same resources that they did while they were part of the study. And so it fades out and returns to what it was.
Okay, that makes really that makes a lot of rational sense. Now, I wanted to ask you a question regarding this, and I know you haven't, you probably have looked into it because you seem like a woman who has done your research.
Yes.
Isn't it true that some people who study intelligence have came to the conclusion that there are different forms of intelligence? Like, I guess there's like creative intelligence, psychological intelligence, something along those lines. Because I know that when they were doing those studies a long time ago on race and intelligence, I guess they were only focusing on one factor, but they didn't focus on, I don't know, like creative thinking, cognitive ability,
Mm-hmm.
mathematical ability, and reading ability. Because I know you got some people out there who are great at math, but they cannot write for whatever reason why. They just can't write. So, do you believe that there are different like forms of intelligence, and some people are stronger in certain categories of intelligence than others?
As far as traditional IQ tests, I think this is already reflected in the subtests. For instance, autistic people often have very lopsided intellects. Like they'll excel in one category and fall behind in another. And I speak from personal experience because I actually have a brother who has autism, and he has a brilliant memory. He can memorize complex medical textbooks all the time, but he struggles with basic algebra. So, and this is very common with people with autism. And I think it's actually more common than people think in neurotypicals as well.
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, something else I wanted to touch on was like when we're talking about like IQ testing. Um, is there really like one universal form of an IQ test to show like true IQ, or is there like hundreds of them? Because I remember one time I was online and I was just dibbling and dabbling, and there was one IQ test that had like 20, 25 questions, and my IQ was really high. I'm like above genius. But then when I took this other IQ test, it basically said, to paraphrase, I was retarded. So when these scholars are doing these tests, even today, because I know they're still doing IQ tests, are they doing the same IQ test, or are they using different, or are they basically creating their own test, which could indeed create personal bias or have biased results?
Well, there are two default IQ tests that I know of: the Ravens metrics and the Wechsler intelligence test for adults and the Wechsler intelligence test for children. And the Wechsler test is less restricted; it tests more skills besides just memory. But the Ravens test is dedicated entirely to memory and pattern recognition, which has correlated the best with other skills like mathematics and scientific propensity.
Okay, okay, yeah, that makes, yeah. Everything you're saying is something that I've always pretty much so, agreed with. Like I've
Mhm.
always told people that, when they're doing these types of studies, I mean, in my personal opinion, like I'm a person who believes in science. I believe in the scientific method, and I do believe that facts matter. But when you're
Mhm.
doing, these types of studies, in my personal opinion, you have to look at the undertones and look at the
Yes.
personal story behind, all of that. You can't just sit here and say black people have a lower IQ because they're genetically inferior and Asian Americans and Europeans are intellectually superior. Now, what about IQ between male and female? Like, how wide is that difference? And is it true that this has something to do with brain size if men, do have a higher IQ?
The intellectual difference between men and women is statistically insignificant. So, no, the brain size difference between men and women does not have a measurable impact on intelligence.
Okay. Yeah, I figured. I figured. Well, yeah, well, Jessica, those you pretty much so summed everything up for me perfectly because I'm currently actually working on a educational project regarding race in the world and also race in
Yeah.
America. And you gave me a lot of good information. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and one thing that I think a lot of people who wade into this topic on the egalitarian side need to realize is that you don't need to invalidate the accuracy of IQ tests in order to disprove this, because we know that they do have a very high rate of accuracy in predicting life outcomes. But we need to look at all the factors that influence intelligence and the factors that could potentially influence it but are difficult to measure.
hmm Okay, okay, I agree with you, Jessica. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate you setting this hangout. I know we had a lot of technical difficulties earlier,
Yeah.
but we stuck through, Jessica. Hopefully, we can have some more conversations in later on in the week. I'm pretty much so
Okay.
open, so I'll send you a message. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All
Thank you.
right.
Thank you.
All right. It's great being on.
All right. Bye.
Bye bye.